What if everything we know about the pioneers of space is only half the story? Behind every gleaming module orbiting Earth, behind every daring mission that pushed humanity further into the cosmos, there were minds whose names never made the headlines: engineers, mathematicians, and visionaries who sketched the future of Orbital living on napkins, in cramped offices, under budgets tighter than a rocket's payload. This is the untold saga of the forgotten architects, the ones who turned science fiction into steel and circuitry while history's spotlight shone elsewhere. Think about the International Space Station, that glittering symbol of human collaboration, floating 250 miles above us. Its design didn't spring fully formed from a single genius. It was built on decades of hidden blueprints, scrapped prototypes, and quiet breakthroughs by people who worked in the shadows. Some of their ideas were so radical they were shelved for years. Others were so elegant they became the invisible backbone of every station that followed. Yet ask anyone to name the minds behind orbital infrastructure, and you'll likely hear silence. That silence is where our journey begins. From the Cold War's secret labs to the unassuming university classrooms where students doodled space habitats between lectures, this is a story of obsession, ingenuity, and sometimes heartbreaking near misses. We'll uncover the political games that buried brilliant designs, the engineering feats that defied gravity's limits, and the unsung heroes who kept dreaming even when the world wasn't watching. Because understanding how we really reached the stars means pulling these names out of the footnotes and giving them the light they deserve, so buckle up. History's about to get rewritten. Long before the first module of the International Space Station ever left the launch pad, there were dreams, wild, sprawling visions of humanity living among the stars. Names like Werner von Braun and Sergei Korolev loom large in those early days, their bold proclamations about spinning space stations and lunar colonies splashed across magazine covers. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find the real magic happened in the margins, where unsung engineers scribbled solutions to problems no one had ever faced before. Take Georgy Grechko, a Soviet designer whose notebooks were filled with sketches of modular compartments, interlocking pieces that could grow and adapt over time. Or Caldwell Johnson, the quiet American engineer who insisted that simplicity was the key to surviving the vacuum of space, designing hardware so reliable it became the backbone of early NASA missions. These weren't just dreamers, they were problem solvers wrestling with the brutal realities of physics, politics, and tight budgets. Grechko's modular approach, for example, was initially dismissed as too complex until the Soviets realized it was the only way to keep their Saliot stations functional during years-long missions. Johnson's minimalist designs, meanwhile, faced skepticism from engineers who wanted flashier solutions, until Apollo proved that his less is more philosophy could withstand the chaos of launch and the silence of deep space. Yet for every breakthrough, there were a dozen ideas left on the drafting table, casualties of Cold War secrecy or bureaucratic short-sightedness. Some of the most revolutionary designs, like Grechko's early concepts for artificial gravity or Johnson's proposals for expandable habitats, were shelved for decades, only to resurface in modern projects like the International Space Station and commercial space stations being built today. The irony, many of these new innovations were dreamed up in musty offices in the 1960s by people who never got credit for seeing the future first. What's even more fascinating is how these forgotten architects worked within and sometimes around the rivalries that defined their era. The Cold War pushed space technology forward at a breakneck pace, but it also meant brilliant ideas were often buried under layers of classification or abandoned when they didn't serve immediate political goals. Grechko's team, for instance, had to disguise their most ambitious plans as minor upgrades to avoid scrutiny from Soviet officials. Johnson, meanwhile, fought quietly against NASA's obsession with beating the Soviets to the moon, arguing that sustainable orbital infrastructure would matter more in the long run. Looking back, their persistence feels almost prophetic. The modular designs, the emphasis on durability, the quiet insistence that space stations shouldn't just be flags planted in orbit, but homes for humanity. These ideas outlasted the political games that tried to sideline them. Today, as private companies and international partners build the next generation of space habitats, they're rediscovering those old blueprints and realizing just how far ahead these unsung visionaries really were. The future they imagined is finally catching up to them. It just took the world a little longer to see what they saw all along. Behind the public triumphs of the space race, hidden battles were fought in windowless offices and high-security workshops, where engineers drafted stations not for glory but for shadows. The Soviet Union's Almaz program, conceived by Vladimir Chelomey, was one of the Cold War's best-kept secrets, military outposts disguised as peaceful scientific labs. While the world celebrated the Saliot stations, few knew these orbiting fortresses carried cameras powerful enough to read license plates from space, their true purpose buried under layers of state secrecy. Chelomey's team worked under crushing pressure, their innovations like automated film return capsules pioneering technologies that would later become standard in reconnaissance satellites. Yet for years, their names were erased from official records, their breakthroughs attributed to others. Across the ocean, America's manned orbiting laboratory was brewing its own quiet revolution. Conceived as a spy station staffed by Air Force astronauts, MOL's engineers grappled with challenges no textbook could solve: how to keep humans alive in a cramped, zero-gravity observatory for weeks at a time. The team's solutions, from compact life support systems to foldable optics, were decades ahead of their time. But when budget cuts axed the program in 1969, their work vanished into classified archives. Only years later would NASA rediscover these ideas, repurposing MOL's blueprints into Skylab, America's first space station. The bitter irony: many of the original MOL engineers never knew their scrapped project had secretly shaped the future. What's striking about these clandestine efforts isn't just their technological audacity, it's how isolation bred ingenuity. Cut off from international collaboration, these teams improvised with startling creativity. Almaz's engineers, for instance, devised a fail-safe system where cosmonauts could manually fire retro rockets if ground control went silent, a feature civilian stations wouldn't adopt until decades later. MOL specialists, meanwhile, perfected ultra-lightweight alloys to save every ounce of launch weight, materials that would later enable longer-duration missions. Their innovations emerged not from open laboratories, but from the urgent constraints of secrecy and scarcity. Yet for all their brilliance, these programs shared a tragic flaw: they were tools of their time. When détente eased Cold War tensions, politicians slashed funding for military space stations, leaving half-built prototypes gathering dust. Almaz's final module flew just once before being abandoned. MOL's hardware was scattered to museums and storage lockers. The engineers who'd poured years into these projects watched as their life's work was dismantled, never suspecting that fragments of their ideas would resurface in modern stations. From the International Space Station's modular spy satellites to private sector habitats now circling Earth. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this hidden chapter isn't about technology, but about vision. These pioneers worked without fanfare, often without hope of recognition, driven by something deeper than politics or paychecks. They understood what few in power did: That orbital infrastructure wasn't just about winning a race, it was about building a foundation for humanity's future in space. And though their names faded into classified reports, their legacy orbits above us still, woven into every module, every docking port, every station that followed. The stars, it turns out, remember what Earth forgets. Picture a space station built like a child's toy, snapping together piece by piece, growing and adapting as needs changed. That radical idea didn't come from a boardroom or a high-profile NASA briefing. It came from Konrad Dannenberg, a soft-spoken engineer who'd followed Werner von Braun from Germany to Huntsville, Alabama, carrying sketches of modular stations in his briefcase. While the world obsessed over moon rockets, Dannenberg was quietly solving a problem no one had fully grasped yet: how to build a space station that could evolve. His vision, a fleet of standardized, swappable modules, each with a dedicated purpose, each replaceable without scrapping the entire station. To aerospace traditionalists, it sounded like heresy. Why abandon the elegance of a single, perfectly engineered structure? But Dannenberg understood something they didn't. In space, flexibility is survival. The resistance was fierce. Early designs for stations like America's Skylab followed the old monolithic model: massive, rigid, and impossible to upgrade once launched. When Dannenberg proposed his modular concept in the 1960s, critics called it clunky, inelegant, but then reality intervened. The Soviets, struggling to keep their Saliot stations operational, stumbled into modularity almost by accident. After a docking mishap left cosmonauts stranded without a way home, engineers' jury rigged a solution, linking a second module as an emergency escape route. Suddenly, the clunky idea had proven its worth. By the time Mir launched in 1986, modularity wasn't just an option, it was the blueprint for the future. Every node, every docking port on that station traced back to Dannenberg's persistence. What made modular design so revolutionary wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. Traditional stations were like castles in orbit, magnificent but frozen in time. Modular stations were living things. Need more lab space? Add a module. Solar panels failing? Swap them out. A medical emergency requiring specialized equipment? Dock it and plug it in. This wasn't just engineering, it was a fundamental shift in how humanity occupied space. And the benefits cascaded. Resupply missions became cheaper and more frequent. Crews could stay longer, and stations could outlive their original missions by decades. The International Space Station, with its ever-changing configuration of labs and airlocks, is the ultimate testament to this idea. Yet Dannenberg's name barely registers in most space histories. Part of the reason lies in timing. His modular proposals peaked during Apollo's heyday, when the moon sucked all the oxygen out of the room. But there's another, quieter factor. Modular design's greatest strength is its invisibility. When every component is replaceable, the system outshines the individuals who built it. That's the paradox of Dannenberg's legacy. His ideas became so foundational that they faded into the background, like the rivets holding a spacecraft together, essential but rarely noticed. Today, as companies like Axiom Space attach new modules to the ISS and Blue Origin plans private orbital complexes, they're walking a path Dannenberg mapped 60 years ago. The irony, many of these modern engineers don't even know his name. They're reinventing principles he scribbled in notebooks, solving problems he'd already cracked. That's how deep his influence runs. The modular revolution became so universal that its origin story got lost in the shuffle. But look closely at any space station blueprint, and you'll see it the ghost of a quiet man from Huntsville who understood that to conquer the cosmos, we'd need to build not monuments but scaffolds. Scaffolds that could grow as we did. While the spotlight often shines on astronauts floating triumphantly in zero gravity, the equations that kept them from spinning helplessly into the void were often scribbled by hands history tried to forget. Meet Margherita Hack, the Italian astrophysicist whose trajectory calculations for early European space missions were so precise they became the gold standard. Yet when male colleagues presented her work at conferences, they introduced it as the computer's results, as if no human mind could have conceived them. Or Eileen Galloway, the American policy strategist who quietly drafted the legal frameworks ensuring space stations could cross international borders without sparking Cold War conflicts, all while being barred from the high-level meetings where her memos were discussed. These women didn't just run numbers, they solved existential crises. Hack's models for orbital decay, for instance, prevented a Soviet space lab from crashing into populated areas when its systems failed. Galloway's treatise allowed rival nations to dock modules together without political explosions, paving the way for the International Space Station. Their breakthroughs weren't incremental, they were the difference between success and catastrophe. Yet in official records, their contributions were often reduced to footnotes or anonymous team efforts, their names erased by a culture that saw mathematics as rote labor rather than creative genius. The erasure wasn't accidental. Aerospace archives reveal a pattern. Women's work was systematically labeled as support rather than innovation, no matter how groundbreaking. When Hack identified a flaw in a station's solar alignment that would have left crews powerless, her correction was filed under her department head's name. Galloway's pivotal drafts on orbital sovereignty were attributed to male diplomats who'd merely signed the final documents. This wasn't just credit theft, it actively distorted technological history. By framing these contributions as mechanical rather than intellectual, institutions implied space stations sprang fully formed from the minds of visionary male leaders, ignoring the intricate calculations that made their dreams physically possible. Yet the legacy of these mathematicians persists in ways even history can't suppress. Modern station navigation software still uses algorithms derived from Hack's handwritten equations. International space law remains rooted in Galloway's principles of shared orbital zones. Their ideas outlasted the systems that tried to bury them, precisely because they were too essential to discard. That's the tragic irony. The very indispensability of their work made it easier to steal. When something works flawlessly, people stop asking who created it. They just assume it was always there. Today, as we celebrate figures like Katherine Johnson, we're not just correcting the record, we're repairing a broken system. Every time a young engineer traces a stability algorithm back to Hack or studies Galloway's treatise, they're reclaiming a lineage that was nearly erased. Because space stations aren't just feats of engineering, they're mosaics of forgotten brilliance, and sometimes the most vital pieces are the ones left in the shadows. The dream of artificial gravity isn't some futuristic fantasy. It's a solution we nearly had 60 years ago, buried under bureaucracy and short-term thinking. Picture Hans Moritz in a Munich lab, sketching a spinning donut-shaped station while his colleagues scoffed. Why complicate things? They argued. Astronauts can tough it out. But Moritz saw what others refused to. Floating might look glamorous, but the human body withers without gravity. His designs, inspired by century-old centrifugal physics, proposed a simple fix: rotate the station and let inertia mimic Earth's pull. It wasn't science fiction, it was middle school physics applied with engineering grit. Yet when he presented his blueprints, the response was a collective shrug. Too heavy, too expensive, too unnecessary. The tragedy: we had working prototypes. NASA Nautilus X, a spinning wheel concept from 1968, could have housed 12 astronauts in a gentle, gravity-like spin. The Soviets tested tether systems, two capsules linked by a cable, twirling like a bowler in orbit. Even the Gemini missions proved the concept worked when astronauts spun their capsule to create micro-G-forces. These weren't pipe dreams, they were hardware-tested solutions. But with the moon race sucking up funds and attention, artificial gravity became a nice-to-have, tossed into the later pile. Later never came. Fast forward to today, and the cost of that delay is measured in atrophied muscles and brittle bones. Astronauts on the ISS spend hours daily strapped to resistance machines, fighting a losing battle against their own biology. It's a problem Moritz's spinning stations could have mitigated, maybe even solved. Studies from Skylab and Mir proved long-term zero-G wrecks the body, yet we've stuck with patchwork fixes instead of revisiting those old spinning designs. The irony, modern engineers are now discovering centrifugal solutions, unaware they're retreading paths mapped in the 1960s. The skeptics weren't entirely wrong, though. Spinning stations are complex. A wheel large enough to avoid motion sickness where your head and feet feel different forces requires massive structures. Tethers risk tangling or snapping, but here's what the critics missed. Every engineering challenge Moritz faced has simpler solutions today. Lightweight composites cut mass. Automated systems manage spin stability. Private companies like SpaceX could launch the parts affordably. The hurdles that seemed insurmountable in the Apollo era are now just Tuesday. Perhaps the most tantalizing what-if lies in the Soviet archives. Buried in old reports are sketches of a hybrid station, part spinning ring, part zero-G lab. Cosmonauts could work in microgravity, then retire to the spinning section to sleep under simulated Earth pull. It was the best of both worlds, and it never left the drawing board. Now, as NASA plans lunar stations and Mars missions, that half-forgotten idea is resurfacing. Scientists finally agree. If we're serious about living in space, we can't keep ignoring gravity. The real question isn't whether spinning stations work. It's whether we'll admit the answers were there all along, waiting in yellowed blueprints and the stubborn brilliance of engineers the world forgot. Saliot 7 was supposed to be dead. By February 1985, the Soviet space station had gone silent, its systems frozen, its power drained, its hull slowly surrendering to the merciless cold of space. Ground control had lost all contact, and the official verdict was grim: abandon it. But in a dimly lit Moscow control room, a handful of engineers refused to accept that answer. Their names Viktor Savinykh, Vladimir Dzhanibkov, and a team of unnamed specialists would never make the front pages, but their desperation would rewrite the playbook for saving space stations. What made their plan so audacious wasn't just the risk, it was the sheer improvisation. No one had ever docked with a lifeless station before. No protocols existed for reviving a spacecraft that had essentially become a frozen, spinning tomb. The engineers worked backward from scraps of data. Temperature readings suggested interior ice buildup. Telemetry hinted at electrical shorts. Their solution was equal parts MacGyver and Newton. They designed a manual docking approach using handheld laser rangefinders and star sightings, a maneuver so precise it defied mission planners' simulations. Then they jury-rigged a power bypass using cables and jumpers, knowing one spark could turn the station into a fireball. The real genius, though, lay in the details no one noticed at the time. Dzhanibkov's decision to slowly thaw Saliot 7 by aligning its solar panels for gradual heat, rather than rushing power, became standard procedure for ISS system failures decades later. Savinykh's meticulous mapping of ice formations inside the station's pipes influenced modern humidity controls. Even their emergency air scrubbers, cobbled together from spare parts, inspired the modular life support systems used today. These weren't just fixes, they were masterclasses in crisis engineering, performed under conditions that would have paralyzed most teams: limited oxygen, failing suits, and the ever-present fear that the next wire they touched might be their last. Yet the most revealing moment came after the mission. While Soviet media celebrated the cosmonauts, the engineers' debriefing notes were quietly filed away, labeled for technical reference only. No medals, no press conferences, just a terse memo stating their methods were not standard practice and shouldn't be repeated. The irony: NASA later obtained those same notes during post-Cold War collaborations and integrated nearly every unapproved technique into ISS emergency manuals. Today, when astronauts train for station blackouts or coolant leaks, they're unknowingly rehearsing steps first taken by those Soviet engineers in the dark, their breaths fogging frozen instrument panels as they willed a dead station back to life. The legacy of Saliot 7's rescue isn't just about skill, it's about mindset. Those engineers treated the station not as a machine, but as a patient, diagnosing vital signs, stabilizing systems, and healing it piece by piece. Modern mission controllers call this clinical engineering, though few know the term was coined in a 1986 Soviet report praising the team's medical-like precision. That philosophy now underpins every major space station protocol, from gradual reboots to contingency docking. The station that was left for dead didn't just survive, it became a blueprint for resilience, proving that even in the void, there's no such thing as hopeless. Only solutions we haven't imagined yet. Long before Artemis promised a return to the moon, a group of engineers in short-sleeved dress shirts and pocket protectors were already drafting humanity's first permanent outpost in lunar orbit. The year was 1966, and NASA Langley Research Center had a radical proposal sitting in their filing cabinets: the Lunar Orbital Station, a spinning, donut-shaped habitat where astronauts could live for months just 60 miles above the moon's surface. At first glance, it looked like science fiction, but the math checked out. Leading the charge was John Houbolt, the same engineer whose stubborn advocacy for lunar orbit rendezvous had saved the Apollo program millions. Now he was fighting for a vision even bolder: a way station between worlds where crews could study the moon's mysteries without the crushing cost of landing every time. Houbolt's team solved problems no one had faced before. How do you shield astronauts from weeks of cosmic radiation without hauling tons of lead into space? Their answer: water-filled walls that doubled as radiation barriers and emergency reserves. What about navigation when Earth is just a distant blue dot? They devised a hybrid system combining star trackers with lunar landmarks. Every subsystem was a masterpiece of ingenuity. The life support recycled humidity from breath into drinking water. The solar arrays folded like origami for launch, then unfurled to the size of tennis courts. But the real stroke of genius was the station's rotation. Unlike Earth-orbiting stations that float weightlessly, Houbolt's design spun slowly, creating enough centrifugal force to give astronauts moon-like gravity in certain sections. This wasn't just a lab, it was a training ground for future lunar settlers, letting them acclimate to partial gravity before ever setting foot on the surface. Then, in 1968, the dream unraveled. With Apollo racing toward Kennedy's end of the decade deadline, NASA budget was stretched thinner than a rocket's thermal coating. The Lunar Orbital Station was labeled a distraction, too expensive, too long-term for politicians craving quick Cold War victories. Houbolt's blueprints were shelved, his team scattered to other projects. The cruel twist: many of their innovations were quietly absorbed into Skylab and later the ISS, stripped of their lunar context. The water shielding concept became standard on space stations. The folding solar arrays flew on dozens of satellites. Even the hybrid navigation system found its way into Mars rover software. But the core vision, that spinning gateway to the moon, vanished into archives, remembered only by a handful of retired engineers who'd scribbled equations on blackboards late into the night. Now, as Artemis rekindles lunar ambitions, those yellowed blueprints are getting a second look. Private companies like Axiom Space are studying Hubble's rotation system for their commercial space stations. NASA Gateway Project, a planned lunar orbit outpost, borrows heavily from his modular docking concepts. The difference: today's engineers have materials Hubble could only dream of: lightweight aerogels for radiation shielding, AI-assisted navigation, and reusable rockets that slash launch costs. What seemed impossibly expensive in 1968 might soon be routine. The lesson here isn't just about technological foresight, it's about the cost of short-term thinking. Hubble's team had mapped out a sustainable path for lunar exploration, one that could have given us a permanent foothold on the moon 50 years earlier. Instead, we got flags and footprints, then decades of stagnation. As we finally return to the moon, their ghost station hangs in orbit as a reminder: the future belongs to those who build for it, even when no one's watching. The 80s weren't just about neon and synth pop. They were the decade corporate boardrooms first dared to dream of selling tickets to orbit. While NASA and the Soviets dominated headlines, teams at Boeing and Lockheed were sketching something radical: space stations built not for flags or science but for profit. Their blueprints, now gathering dust in corporate archives, were as audacious as they were overlooked. Boeing's Space Operations Center proposed a sprawling commercial hub where pharmaceutical companies could manufacture zero-gravity drugs, while Lockheed's Starlab envisioned a luxury orbital hotel with panoramic windows and a weightless cocktail lounge. These weren't government projects with endless budgets. They were business plans complete with revenue projections and shareholder pitches, and the engineers behind them. Their names were scrubbed from presentations, reduced to Boeing Advanced Concepts Group or Lockheed Special Projects Team. What made these designs so groundbreaking wasn't just their commercial ambition, it was their pragmatism. Government stations treated cost as an afterthought, but corporate engineers had to justify every bolt. Boeing's team, for instance, pioneered dual-use modules that could switch between labs and living quarters, maximizing rental income. Lockheed's designers scrapped traditional solar arrays for foldable, mass-produced panels that snapped together like Lego bricks. These weren't just engineering choices. They were revolutions in orbital economics. Yet when the Challenger disaster shattered confidence in private space ventures, these projects were shelved overnight, their innovations quietly folded into classified military satellites or forgotten entirely. The irony: today's private space race is rediscovering their playbook. When Axiom Space builds commercial modules for the ISS, they're using Boeing's 40-year-old calculations on optimal lab-to-living space ratios. SpaceX's Starship habitats borrow structural tricks from Lockheed's mothballed Starlab schematics. Even the idea of orbital tourism, now championed by Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, was profit-tested in 80s boardrooms, complete with marketing studies on what wealthy clients would pay to float by a window. The difference: today's CEOs get fame, while the engineers who proved it was possible never got a footnote. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the constraints these teams overcame. Without reusable rockets, they designed stations to launch on single-use Titans and shuttles, cramming elegance into brutal weight limits. Without modern materials, they sketched aluminum hulls that could handle decades of micrometeorite strikes. Their work proved private companies could think decades ahead if someone was willing to pay. Now, as corporations finally circle back to their vision, it's worth asking: How much further along might we be if those 80s dreamers had gotten their shot? The answer's written in the stars and in the patents they left behind. History remembers the space race as a two-player game, America versus the Soviets, flags and fistfights in the stars. But dig through the technical archives and you'll find fingerprints from places the spotlight never touched. Take Ujupi Ramachandra Rao, the Indian physicist whose team at ISRO cracked Modular Station, designs a full decade before the ISS was even a sketch. While NASA and Roscosmos were still welding monolithic structures, Rao's blueprints showed clusters of standardized pods, each self-contained, each replaceable, linked by corridors that could expand like train cars. It was elegance born of necessity. India's shoestring budget forced innovations the superpowers couldn't see past their own gargantuan programs. Yet when the ISS finally embraced modularity in the 90s, no one mentioned Rao's papers gathering dust in Bangalore filing cabinets. Japan's forgotten pioneers faced a different kind of erasure. Engineers at NASA, now JAXA, solved one of orbital living's nastiest problems: how to scrub carbon dioxide from air without bulky, power-hungry systems. Their solution, a ceramic filter infused with microscopic ridges that trapped CO2 molecules like Velcro. Tested on Japan's Kibo module in 2008, it used 80% less energy than NASA systems. But when American reporters covered the ISS's life support upgrades, the breakthrough was credited to international collaboration, a vague label that buried the individual minds behind it. The pattern repeated with Europe's gravity research. German fluid dynamics specialists like Marguerite Johns spent the 70s mapping how liquids behave in partial gravity, data that became the foundation for modern space station plumbing. Yet her name appears in exactly 0 Apollo-era documentaries. Why did these contributions vanish? Sometimes it was Cold War politics. Journalists weren't keen to highlight Allies' successes when the narrative revolved around superpower rivalry. Other times it was sheer bureaucracy. Rao's modular designs, for instance, were published in Indian journals rarely read by Western engineers until years later. But the deepest bias was cultural, the assumption that breakthrough ideas could only come from the two nations with the biggest rockets. That blind spot cost decades of progress. NASA early station concepts struggled with radiation shielding until someone rediscovered notes from Argentina's INVAP team, who'd pioneered boron-infused hull coatings in the 80s. The Soviets wasted millions on flawed docking ports before stumbling upon a Japanese patent for magnetic alignment guides filed in 1979 and ignored. The bitter truth: space stations could have been safer, cheaper, and more advanced if anyone had bothered to look beyond Cape Canaveral and Baikonur. Rao's modular vision might have saved the ISS years of retrofitting. Johns's fluid models could have prevented the notorious space bubble incidents that plagued early missions. But history isn't just about who solves problems, it's about who gets to hand out the credit. Now, as new players like India's Gaganyaan and Japan's Gateway modules join the orbital construction boom, there's a chance to rewrite that script, not just by adding new names to the list, but by asking how much further we might already be if the list hadn't been so short to begin with. Galina Balashova's blueprints didn't just calculate load-bearing stresses or airflow, they accounted for loneliness. As the Soviet Union's chief architect for space interiors in the 1960s and 70s, she faced a challenge no textbook covered: how to make a metal tube orbiting 200 miles above Earth feel like home. While American designers obsessed over cramming in more equipment, Balashova sketched curved walls to soften the claustrophobia of narrow corridors. She insisted on warm amber lighting to mimic sunsets, knowing cosmonauts would spend months without seeing one. Even her color palettes were psychological weapons: soft greens to ease eye strain, strategic red accents to stimulate alertness during critical maneuvers. Every choice was a rebellion against the era's utilitarian dogma, proving that in space, beauty wasn't frivolous, it was survival. Her masterwork was the Soyuz orbital module, a cramped sphere that somehow felt spacious. By angling storage compartments outward like petals, she created the illusion of depth. Mirrored surfaces placed at precise intervals tricked the eye into perceiving extra square footage. But her boldest stroke was the Balashova window, a small, circular porthole framed by a cushioned rim, positioned not for instrumentation but purely for the soul. Cosmonauts reported spending hours curled against it, watching continents scroll beneath them, their mental health tethered to that single gesture of humanity. Modern ergonomic studies later confirmed what she'd intuited. In isolation, visual harmony reduces cortisol levels as effectively as medication. Yet when the Iron Curtain fell, so did her influence. Post-Soviet space programs, desperate to appear serious to Western partners, purged anything deemed decorative. The International Space Station became a monument to sterile efficiency, fluorescent lights, exposed wiring, and beige panels chosen for cost, not comfort. Astronauts joked it felt less like a habitat and more like a flying server room. The irony: NASA's own psychologists eventually replicated Balashova's findings, proving that her aesthetic choices boosted crew morale by 30%. By then, her name had vanished from the archives, her contributions reduced to a footnote in a Moscow Design Institute's yearbook. Private space stations might finally correct that oversight. Companies like Orbital Assembly are consulting old Soviet papers on cosmic ambience, while Axiom's planned modules feature Balashova-inspired curved walls and dynamic lighting. Even NASA's Lunar Gateway includes her window design, though few acknowledge its origins. The lesson here isn't just about aesthetics, it's about recognizing that engineers aren't just building machines for humans, they're building environments that make humans. And sometimes the quietest lines on a blueprint, the ones that account for tears, for yearning, for the need to feel grounded when you're utterly untethered, are the ones that keep us reaching for the stars. Harold Finger never saw space, never floated weightless, never watched Earth curve below him, yet every breath taken aboard the International Space Station carries his invisible signature. While astronauts became household names, Finger and his team at NASA, a nuclear systems division, worked in a windowless Virginia lab, solving a problem so fundamental most never consider it: how to keep human lungs from poisoning themselves in a sealed metal box. Their breakthrough wasn't flashy rockets or sleek modules, it was a humming metal canister filled with lithium hydroxide, a substance that could trap carbon dioxide molecules like a molecular Venus flytrap. Simple, maybe; revolutionary, absolutely. Before Finger's scrubber design, engineers assumed stations would need massive, power-hungry systems to filter air. His elegant solution weighed less than a suitcase, required no electricity, and saved countless missions from catastrophic CO2 buildup. Yet when Apollo astronauts praised their life support systems, no one mentioned the quiet engineer whose chemistry homework from the 1940s had just saved their lives. The real magic of these unsung systems lies in their brutal efficiency. Take the Sabatier reactor, a device that transforms astronaut sweat and breath into drinking water through a process dreamed up by French chemist Paul Sabatier in the 1890s. Forgotten for decades, the concept was resurrected by a team at Marshall Space Flight Center in the 1970s, led by an unassuming engineer named Larry Clark. His innovation, pairing Sabatier's chemistry with space-hardened pumps that could run for years without maintenance. Today, the ISS recycles 90% of its water this way, a feat that would have seemed like alchemy to early station designers. But Clark's name appears nowhere in the glossy mission brochures, his contribution reduced to a line in technical manuals, system based on prior work. What's staggering isn't just the ingenuity of these inventions, it's the conditions they overcame. Genevieve Grotjen, a mathematician turned life support specialist, spent the 60s calculating oxygen ratios for Skylab using pencil and graph paper because computers couldn't handle the variables. Her equations ensured crews wouldn't suffocate or ignite their atmosphere with a single spark, yet her workspace was a converted janitor's closet at Johnson Space Center. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet engineer Zoya Brukhova worked similar miracles with even less jury-rigging algae tanks to supplement oxygen on Saliot stations, a system so reliable it later inspired modern bioregenerative designs. These weren't just solutions, they were acts of defiance against the impossible constraints of mass, volume, and the unforgiving arithmetic of orbital physics. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of these hidden systems is how they've outlived their creators. When a critical CO2 scrubber failed on the ISS in 2010, astronauts MacGyvered a replacement using spare parts and a manual written by Finger's team 30 years prior. The algae tanks Brukhova perfected are now being tested for Mars missions, their simple elegance outperforming high-tech alternatives. Even Grotjen's handwritten oxygen tables still serve as emergency backups for modern stations. That's the paradox of their work. The more seamless the solution, the faster the solver disappears from history. We remember the storms, not the seawalls that keep them at bay. Now, as private companies race to build new stations, they're rediscovering these old playbooks. Startups brag about innovative water recyclers that are near clones of Clark's Sabatier design. Inflatable habitats tout revolutionary CO2 management until engineers dig up Finger's original patents. The lesson isn't just about giving credit where it's overdue. It's about recognizing that the future of space depends as much on these forgotten fundamentals as on shiny new rockets. Because in the end, no amount of thrust or glamour matters if the people inside can't take their next breath. And thanks to these quiet architects of survival, they can. Maxime Fagot's blueprints for America's first space station were technically flawless, politically radioactive. As NASA chief engineer during the Apollo era, he'd already designed the Mercury capsule and sketched early concepts for what would become Skylab. But when his team proposed a dedicated orbital lab in 1962, they stumbled into a bureaucratic minefield. The Air Force had its own vision, a militarized station bristling with surveillance gear, codenamed the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. What followed wasn't just a debate over hardware, it was a bare-knuckle power struggle that would stall America's station ambitions for nearly a decade. Fagot's designs embodied NASA scientific ideals modules packed with telescopes, biology labs, and Earth observation gear. The Air Force's proposals read like spy novels, high-resolution cameras, encrypted data links, and crews trained for reconnaissance. Both sides dug in. NASA dismissed the military's plans as wasteful duplication. The Air Force mocked civilian stations as toys for eggheads. Behind closed doors, the clash turned vicious. Budget documents from 1966 reveal how Air Force lobbyists quietly slashed NASA station funding, while NASA retaliated by blocking military access to Apollo hardware. The casualties, brilliant concepts from both camps like Fagot's fold-out solar arrays and the Air Force's revolutionary Star Tracker navigation, that languished in drawers while committees argued. The irony, each side desperately needed the other's breakthroughs. NASA life support systems were primitive compared to the Air Force's compact scrubbers, developed for high-altitude spy planes. The military, meanwhile, craved Fagot's radiation shielding expertise for their crews' long-duration missions. But Cold War paranoia made collaboration impossible. Classified memos show Pentagon officials forbidding engineers from sharing even basic metallurgy data, fearing it might leak to the Soviets through NASA international partners. The result was a grotesque duplication of effort, two separate teams inventing the same docking mechanisms, the same thermal coatings, the same waste recycling systems, all while pretending the other didn't exist. Faggott's personal notes from this period reveal a man torn between fury and resignation. In one 1968 journal entry, he scribbled, "We could have had a station orbiting by now if they'd just let us build the damn thing." He wasn't wrong. By the time the manned orbiting laboratory was cancelled in 1969, victim of budget cuts and the rise of unmanned spy satellites, Skylab's launch had been delayed 5 years. Engineers rushed to salvage scraps from both programs, bolting Air Force camera mounts onto NASA, solar observatories, and repurposing military life support tech for civilian crews. The hybrid that emerged was functional, but far from the elegant stations either team had originally envisioned. What's rarely acknowledged is how this feud shaped space stations forever. The bitter lessons of those wasted years birthed the dual-use philosophy behind today's ISS, where science and security hardware coexist in carefully negotiated harmony. Faggott himself later admitted the rivalry forced NASA to toughen its engineering standards, adopting military-grade redundancy protocols that saved Skylab when it suffered catastrophic damage during launch. Even the bureaucratic trenches he dug became valuable. His battles for civilian control created precedents that still keep orbital research free from military dominance. The real tragedy isn't that the conflict happened, it's that history remembers only the showdown, not the quiet collaborations that eventually emerged. Buried in archive footage from 1973, there's a fleeting moment, Faggott sharing a cigarette outside mission control with an Air Force colonel, both watching Skylab's first crew dock with the patched-together station. No speeches, no handshakes, just two exhausted men who'd spent a decade fighting, finally seeing their scrambled dreams take flight. The stations we build tomorrow will stand on the wreckage of those battles and on the stubborn vision of engineers who kept drawing the future, even when the suits couldn't agree whose future it was. Margaret Hamilton's Apollo code may have saved the moon landing, but the unsung heroes of orbital software were the ones who kept astronauts breathing. While Hamilton's team grappled with lunar modules, a parallel universe of programmers huddled over teletype machines, writing the invisible instructions that governed air mixtures, pressure valves, and waste recyclers on early space stations. Their names: Robert Swanson, who debugged Skylab's oxygen regulator at 3 a.m. with punch cards scattered across his kitchen table; Irina Yashina, the Soviet coder who manually rewrote Saliot's thermal control algorithms mid-mission when a solar flare corrupted the original tapes. These weren't just lines of code, they were lifelines, written under constraints that would give modern developers nightmares. Consider the tools they lacked. No real-time simulators to test their work, no cloud backups when files corrupted. Yashina's team debugged using paper printouts and a hand-cranked mechanical calculator, their compiler, a room full of technicians flipping switches in sequence. Swanson's critical Skylab patches had to be loaded via audio tones, literally played over the radio like a dial-up modem from hell. One misplaced semicolon could mean suffocation or explosive decompression, yet they worked without the safety nets of version control or automated error checking. The stakes etched themselves into their process. NASA Gemini-era programmers developed a ritual called triple handing, where 3 engineers independently wrote the same function, then compared results line by line. It was inefficient, maddening, and the only way to be sure. The real marvel wasn't just their precision, but their foresight. When Hamilton's team prioritized fault tolerance in Apollo's software, her lesser-known counterparts took it further. They built systems that could degrade gracefully, like the Saliot programmers who designed CO2 scrubbers to prioritize life support over science experiments when memory errors occurred. Or the Americans who coded Skylab's solar panels to auto-rotate during processor failures, buying time for ground crews to fix the issue. These weren't features, they were acts of moral philosophy disguised as Fortran. Every decision acknowledged the brutal truth. In orbit, software wasn't just a tool, it was the thin layer between survival and oblivion. Yet history flattened their contributions into footnotes. Yashina's breakthroughs were credited to the Kaliningrad Group. Swanson's oxygen regulator fix became a NASA team effort. Even the triple handing technique got repackaged as corporate policy, stripped of the human stories behind it. The erasure wasn't malicious, just systemic. When your code works perfectly, no one notices it exists, but the legacy of these ghost architects lives on in every modern station. The ISS's fault-tolerant operating system, rooted in those Gemini-era rituals, the automated emergency protocols that saved Crew Dragon during a thruster failure. Grandchildren of Yashina's adaptive algorithms, now, as AI promises to revolutionize orbital software, their lessons feel more urgent than ever. Today's programmers have tools those pioneers couldn't dream of: machine learning, quantum computing, cloud-based collaboration. But the core challenge remains unchanged: how to write instructions that keep humans alive in an environment that wants them dead. The answers might lie in silicon now, but the wisdom came from flesh and blood coders who stared into the void and typed back. The metals that never flew tell their own story of what could have been. Hidden in a Moscow warehouse, a batch of Soviet-developed aluminum alloy panels sits untouched, their surfaces still gleaming after 50 years, untouched by the corrosion that plagues conventional spacecraft materials. The secret, a trace infusion of scandium, a rare earth metal that made the alloy 40% stronger while remaining astonishingly lightweight. Developed in the 1970s by metallurgist Leonid Karatonov, this material could have revolutionized orbital construction until the Politburo deemed it too expensive for mass production. Today, as private companies spend millions developing carbon fiber composites, Karatonov's formula gathers dust, its potential untested beyond a few ground experiments. Across the Atlantic, NASA, a material science division, was chasing an even wilder dream: self-healing polymers. Picture a station hull that could seal micrometeorite punctures like human skin clotting a wound. By embedding microscopic capsules of reactive chemicals into resin layers, engineer Alicia Thompson's team created prototypes that automatically fused cracks when exposed to vacuum conditions. Early tests in 1982 showed promise: a quarter-inch hole vanishing within minutes as the released chemicals polymerized. But when the Challenger disaster shifted budgets toward safety over innovation, the project was shelved. The cruel twist: modern aerospace labs are now racing to replicate Thompson's exact mechanism, unaware her team had solved it decades prior. The graveyard of abandoned materials holds more than metals and plastics. Consider the ceramic foam tiles pioneered by Japan's JAXA in the 1990s, porous enough to block radiation yet sturdy enough to withstand orbital debris impacts. Too fragile for Earth launch, they were designed to be manufactured in space using lunar minerals. When international lunar base plans stalled, the tiles became museum curiosities. Or the German-developed smart glass that could transition from transparent to opaque with an electric pulse, eliminating bulky window shutters on stations. Rejected over concerns about power consumption, it's now being rediscovered by designers of Martian habitats. What unites these forgotten innovations isn't just bad timing, it's a fundamental mismatch between engineering vision and political cycles. Materials science operates on decade-long timelines, while space programs pivot with each administration. Kharitonov's alloy needed 5 more years of refinement to lower costs. Thomson's polymers required in orbit testing no committee would fund. These weren't dead ends, they were bridges to futures that never arrived. Now, as lunar bases and Mars missions renew interest in advanced materials, archaeologists of technology are digging through old reports. That scandium alloy, being reconsidered for asteroid mining rigs where strength-to-weight ratios are critical. The self-healing polymers, patents quietly filed by 3 different space startups last year. Even the ceramic tiles have resurfaced in Blue Origin's lunar lander specs. The lesson isn't just about rediscovery, it's about recognizing that the next giant leap might not need new science, just the wisdom to revisit old notebooks with fresh eyes. After all, the future belongs to those who listen to the whispers of abandoned labs as much as the cheers of launch pads. Imagine a world where entire cities drift gracefully through the void, not cramped metal cans, but vast, Earth-like landscapes curled inside spinning cylinders so large they have their own weather. This wasn't just the fever dream of sci-fi authors. In the 1970s, while NASA was perfecting tiny space stations, anonymous teams of architects and engineers were drafting blueprints for orbital metropolises that could house millions. Their names are lost to time, but their visions Bernal spheres with their sunlit farmland, O'Neill cylinders where entire rivers flowed uphill due to centrifugal force, remain some of the most audacious engineering concepts ever put to paper. The real genius of these designs wasn't their scale, but their attention to the mundane details that make life livable. Take the Princeton team working under Gerard O'Neill's mentorship. Their cylinder habitats weren't just steel shells, they accounted for everything from seasonal light cycles, achieved with mirrors that tilted like giant Venetian blinds, to the psychological need for horizons. One forgotten grad student's thesis proposed arranging towns along the curve so that standing on a hill would let you see distant neighborhoods arching upward, counteracting the disorientation of living in a spinning can. Meanwhile, Soviet collectives sketched their own versions, like the Telina concept, a cluster of rotating toruses connected by transit tubes, where each ring represented a different biome: forests in one, grasslands in another, creating a self-sustaining arc. Why did these megastructures stall? The answers lie in a mix of physics and politics. The materials needed to build kilometer-long structures that wouldn't tear themselves apart simply didn't exist in the 70s. Even today, producing enough graphene or carbon nanotubes for a single O'Neill cylinder would bankrupt most nations, but the deeper hurdle was ideological. The space race had been about flags and footprints, not homesteads. When O'Neill testified before Congress in 1975, pleading for funding to study space colonies, one senator famously scoffed, "Why build New York when we haven't even pitched a tent on the moon?" Yet the legacy of these dreamers is more tangible than it seems. Modern asteroid mining proposals borrow their resource calculations. SpaceX's Starship was designed with the mass budgets of large-scale habitats in mind. Even the ISS's greenhouse experiments trace back to those 70s studies on closed ecosystems. The irony, the teams who drafted these visions knew they wouldn't live to see them built. Their reports are littered with phrases like "for implementation in the 21st century" and "assuming advances in material science." They weren't designing for their own era. They were planting trees whose shade they'd never enjoy. Now, as lunar bases transition from concept to construction, their work is being exhumed. Private ventures like Orbital Assembly are adapting O'Neill's rotation principles for smaller, modular stations. NASA Artemis Accords quietly include provisions for future large-scale orbital settlements, a nod to those old megastructure treaties. The math hasn't changed. If humanity wants to thrive in space, we'll need more than outposts, we'll need worlds. And thanks to those anonymous drafters of the 70s, we already have the blueprints. The only question is whether we'll muster the courage to pick up where they left off. The Soviet Union's secret isolation chambers held answers to questions NASA wouldn't think to ask for decades. Behind the Iron Curtain in the 1960s, while America focused on beating the Soviets to the moon, psychologist Oleg Gazenko was running experiments that would reveal an uncomfortable truth. Space stations weren't just engineering challenges, they were psychological pressure cookers. His team locked cosmonaut candidates in windowless steel capsules for months, simulating missions to Mars. The goal wasn't to test equipment, but to study how isolation warps human minds. What they discovered should have rewritten every space agency's playbook. Gazenko's most chilling finding: conflict wasn't the exception, it was the mathematical certainty. After 42 days in confinement, even the most disciplined teams fractured along predictable fault lines. Petty grievances over noise levels or hygiene escalated into screaming matches. One subject smashed a water ration dispenser after a crewmate hummed off-key for hours. Another falsified experiment data just to create drama. The real surprise was the timing. Hostilities peaked not during high-stress emergencies, but in monotonous stretches between milestones. Without external stimuli, the brain turned inward, magnifying irritations until they became existential threats. These weren't just academic observations. Gazenko's team developed countermeasures that bordered on prophetic. They learned that assigning overlapping responsibilities forced cooperation, like making the medic also manage waste recycling. They found that structured rituals, even silly ones like cosmonaut tea time, created psychological anchors in timeless environments. Most radically, they proved that privacy mattered more than space. Subjects in cramped but well-partitioned modules fared better than those in open designs. Yet when Gazenko published his results, Soviet officials redacted the reports, fearing they'd expose vulnerabilities. By the time declassified fragments reached the West in the 1990s, Mir Cruz had already relived every scenario he'd warned about. The tragedy isn't that Gazenko's work was ignored, it's that others had to rediscover it the hard way. NASA's first major crew conflict study didn't begin until 2009, when ISS astronauts reported near mutinies over cultural clashes and sleep deprivation. Their solutions, like standardized conflict resolution protocols, mirrored Gazenko's 1968 recommendations almost verbatim. Even modern private stations are repeating old mistakes. Axiom Space's early habitat designs minimized private quarters until psychologists dug up those Soviet archives showing how visual privacy reduces stress hormones by 30%. What makes these forgotten studies so vital today isn't just their accuracy, it's their urgency. As missions stretch toward Mars, where communication delays will eliminate real-time therapy sessions with ground control, Gazenko's insistence on self-sufficient coping mechanisms becomes terrifyingly relevant. His most prescient experiment simulated a 6-month Mars mission with a twist. Halfway through, he cut off all contact with Earth. The crew didn't panic, they adapted, developing their own slang, inside jokes, and decision-making frameworks. That improvisation is now the gold standard for deep space mission planning. The lesson hiding in those yellowed notebooks isn't about space at all. It's about how isolation distills human nature to its essence, revealing both our fragility and our resilience. Every orbital argument, every moment of despair or camaraderie aboard modern stations was foreshadowed in those Moscow basements. The difference, Today's crews have the chance to learn from those ghosts if anyone bothers to read their warnings. The balance sheets told a story no mission patch could capture, columns of numbers that quietly strangled more orbital dreams than any rocket failure ever did. While engineers sketched modules and astronauts trained for missions that never flew, an invisible war played out in budget committees and corporate boardrooms where the language wasn't Delta V or life support, but ROI and fiscal quarters. Take the case of Space Station Freedom, NASA, an ambitious 1980s project that promised a permanent human presence in orbit. Its fate wasn't decided by thermal shielding or docking ports, but by a little-known congressional aide named Lisa Reed, who scribbled a single line in a 1989 appropriations memo: "Cost projections exceed political will." That scribble triggered 12 redesigns, shrinking the station from a sprawling orbital campus to the skeletal framework that eventually became the ISS. Corporate ventures faced even harsher arithmetic when Rockwell International pitched their Orbital Hilton concept in 1992. Complete with luxury suites and a zero-G sports arena, Wall Street's response was brutal. Analysts noted the $120 million per tourist price tag, nearly $250 million today, and dismissed it as fantasy economics. The project died without fanfare, its blueprints shelved alongside other casualties of spreadsheet realism. Even the Soviets weren't immune. The breathtaking MKBS megastation, designed to house 100 cosmonauts, was axed not by Politburo decree, but by a deputy finance minister's back-of-the-envelope calculation, showing it would consume 18% of the entire Soviet space budget for a decade. The cruelest twist: many cancelled stations never truly died, they were dismembered for parts. Lockheed's 1995 commercial lab concept, deemed too expensive as a standalone station, had its radiation shielding tech quietly folded into military satellites. Japan's cancelled Hope X station gifted its revolutionary solar array design to what became the Kibo module. These weren't failures so much as forced organ donations, their best ideas living on in projects that could attract funding. What's rarely acknowledged is how these financial constraints accidentally bred innovation. When the European Space Agency's Columbus module faced 1996 budget cuts, engineers invented dual-load structural members, components that served as both hull supports and wiring conduits, slashing weight and cost. That breakthrough became standard in modern stations. Similarly, Russia's cash-strapped 90s space program pioneered kludge architecture, repurposing old Mir components into new configurations, proving stations could evolve through scavenging as well as grand designs. The ghosts of these unfunded futures still haunt today's orbital economy. Every time a private company promises affordable space stations, they're unknowingly echoing proposals from the 1970s that drowned in red ink. When NASA wrestles with cost overruns on Lunar Gateway, they're reliving battles first fought over Skylab. The difference now: the players have changed. Congressional aides have been replaced by venture capital committees, and the veto power has shifted from governments to billionaire whims. But the equation remains the same: vision divided by dollars equals reality. The stations we have aren't the ones we dreamed of, they're the ones we could afford. Koichi Wakata's hands shook as he tightened the final bolt on the Kibo module's exterior platform, not from fear but from exhaustion. Floating 250 miles above Earth in 2013, the Japanese engineer-turned-astronaut had just completed the most complex single-handed spacewalk in ISS history, a 6-hour ballet of precision with no margin for error. Back on Earth, NASA hailed it as a milestone for international cooperation. Few mentioned Wakata's name. Fewer still knew this moment capped 15 years of sleepless nights in Tsukuba Labs, where he'd helped design Kibo's every hinge and circuit, knowing he might never see his work firsthand. That's the paradox of the ISS. The more nations contribute, the easier it becomes to lose the individuals behind the triumph. The station's true origin story isn't found in glossy press kits, but in forgotten meeting minutes from the 1990s, like the Brussels summit where Canadian robotics specialist Julie Payette, yes, that Julie Payette, before she became an astronaut and governor general, brokered a last-minute compromise between American and Russian teams deadlocked over docking mechanisms. Her solution, a hybrid adapter combining Russian probe and cone reliability with NASA androgynous design, enabling the ISS's first modules to link seamlessly. The hardware earned headlines. Payette's diplomatic maneuvering vanished into Appendix D of a technical report. Quiet revolutions shaped every subsystem. Brazilian engineer Marcos Pontes, who later became his country's first astronaut, spent years perfecting the station's vibration-damping materials essential for microgravity experiments. His breakthrough came from studying rainforest tree roots that absorb seismic energy, translated into metallic foam layers now lining every ISS rack. European Space Agency teams in Cologne pioneered the station's water recycling algorithms by mimicking alpine glacier filtration, while Russian specialists from the obscure RKK Energy subsidiary, Zvezda, engineered the Soyuz lifeboat seats to accommodate bodies weakened by months in zero-G, using data from 70-year-old Gulag survival studies. The true cost of this collaboration wasn't just measured in yen or rubles, but in personal sacrifices. Italian astronaut Luca Pomitano nearly drowned during a 2013 spacewalk when his helmet filled with water, yet returned to orbit 6 years later to install the very European lab modules he'd helped design as a junior engineer. South Korean systems analyst Ji So-yeon worked 80-hour weeks integrating her country's experiments into ISS protocols, knowing she'd never fly there herself, her single spaceflight ending with a harrowing ballistic re-entry that sidelined her from further missions. These weren't just contributors, they were devotees who risked careers, health, and sometimes sanity for fragments of orbital immortality. What's startling isn't the scale of their contributions, but how thoroughly the system erased them. NASA's famous meatball logo appears on every ISS patch, but the insignias of JAXA Material Science Division or ESA's Thermal Analysis Group don't. When modules dock flawlessly or experiments yield Nobel-worthy discoveries, credit flows to agencies, not the Kazakh propulsion specialist who recalculated thruster burns during a solar storm, or the Japanese life support technician who caught a CO2 scrubber flaw during a graveyard shift. The ISS's greatest achievement, transcending nationalism, became its greatest irony. In becoming everyone's station, it risked becoming no one's story. Yet traces of these ghost architects linger in the station's bones. The subtle curve of Kibo's handrails, shaped by Wakata's insistence on ergonomics after watching crewmates struggle with sharp-edged American designs. The faint scent of maple in the Canadian airlock, a nod to the Montreal team who insisted on non-toxic sealants. Even the station's orbit carefully balanced to accommodate launches from Baikonur, Florida, and Tanegashima, bears the fingerprints of 100 unnamed trajectory planners who mapped the compromises. They understood what the politicians didn't. That orbital cooperation wasn't about flags or fame, but about the quiet satisfaction of solving puzzles no single nation could crack alone. The ISS flies not because it was designed by committees, but because individuals like Wakata and Payette smuggled brilliance through bureaucracy's cracks. The concept of a Martian way station didn't begin with Elon Musk's tweets or modern Mars colonization plans. It was quietly mapped out in the 90s by a team of NASA engineers working in the shadow of cancelled dreams. Their project, the Mars Design Reference Mission, envisioned a network of orbital depots circling the red planet like cosmic pit stops, where ships could refuel and resupply before descending to the surface or returning to Earth. Leading the charge was astronaut engineer Robert Zubrin, who argued that without these staging posts, Mars missions would be hopelessly inefficient, requiring spacecraft to haul all their fuel and supplies from Earth in one colossal, wasteful bundle. His team's blueprints showed clusters of cylindrical modules, their skins lined with ice-filled shielding to block radiation, their interiors packed with electrolysis units to crack Martian water into hydrogen and oxygen for propellant. It was elegant, practical, and shelved before the ink could dry. The reason? A perfect storm of politics and short-sightedness. Congressional hearings from 1996 reveal how Zubrin's depots were dismissed as science fiction by lawmakers who couldn't grasp their role in a larger strategy. Budget hawks slashed funding, preferring flashy one-off missions like the Mars Pathfinder rover over the unglamorous infrastructure that would make sustained exploration possible. Even within NASA, resistance simmered. Old guard engineers, wedded to Apollo-era thinking, argued that depots added unnecessary complexity, never mind that their proposed direct ascent missions would require rockets the size of skyscrapers. The debate wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. Zubrin's team saw Mars as a destination to inhabit, while their critics viewed it as a trophy to briefly visit. What's tragic isn't just that the depots were cancelled, it's how close they came to reality. Lockheed Martin had already built prototype fuel processors for the depots, testing them in vacuum chambers that simulated Martian orbit. A team at Johnson Space Center had perfected zero-gravity fluid transfer systems, solving the problem of pumping liquid hydrogen without explosive vapor buildup. These weren't PowerPoint slides, they were hardware sitting on shelves, waiting for a mission that never came. The real kicker, those very technologies are now being reinvented from scratch by private companies, unaware that NASA had already debugged them 30 years prior. The ghost of these depots haunts every modern Mars plan. SpaceX's Starship architecture leans heavily on orbital refueling, a concept Zubrin's team mathematically proved was the only viable path to sustainable Mars missions. NASA's Lunar Gateway, initially mocked as a toll booth in space, inadvertently validated the depot philosophy by demonstrating how orbital hubs could slash mission costs. Even the depot's most controversial feature, relying on Martian resources for fuel, is now gospel among Mars planners, thanks to breakthroughs by the same researchers who worked on the 90s mission. The lesson buried in those old blueprints isn't about hardware, it's about patience. Zubrin's team understood that interplanetary infrastructure couldn't be built in one administration or even one generation. Their depots were seeds meant to germinate over decades, quietly enabling the future while others argued about timelines. Now, as new rockets finally make their vision feasible, the real question isn't whether we'll build Martian way stations, it's whether we'll admit we're following a map drawn by the very people we once ignored. Long before sustainability became a buzzword on Earth, orbital engineers were wrestling with a far more urgent challenge: how to keep astronauts alive without constant resupply missions from the ground. The solution didn't come from flashy hardware or billion-dollar budgets, but from the unlikeliest of heroes, Algae. In the cramped labs of NASA Ames Research Center during the 1970s, biologist Joan Vernikos stared at swirling tanks of green goo, convinced these microscopic organisms held the key to permanent space habitation. Her experiments with Chlorella vulgaris weren't just about oxygen production. They were the first serious attempt to close the loop in space, turning human waste and carbon dioxide back into food and breathable air through nothing but sunlight and photosynthesis. The results astonished even skeptics. A single cubic meter of algae could support a human indefinitely, recycling 90% of a crew's metabolic waste. Yet when Vernikos presented her findings, the response was bureaucratic silence. The Apollo era was ending, and NASA's focus had shifted to short-duration shuttle missions where weighty life support systems seemed unnecessary. Her algae tanks were dismissed as messy compared to sterile chemical scrubbers. Her vision of self-sustaining stations labeled overly ambitious, the cruel irony. 40 years later, the International Space Station still relies on shipments of lithium hydroxide canisters for CO2 removal, a single-point failure system Vernikos's algae could have made obsolete. Meanwhile, China's space program, unburdened by institutional inertia, has quietly incorporated her principles into their Tiangong station's experimental life support modules. The algae saga was just the beginning. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet engineers were pushing sustainability even further with their closed ecological systems experiments. The BIOS 3 facility in Siberia, a windowless steel bunker buried beneath permafrost, locked crews for months with nothing but plants and microbes to sustain them. Wheat grew under artificial lights, its roots filtering urine into clean water. Duckweed ponds recycled organic waste into edible protein. By 1975, they'd achieved 95% closure, a record that still stands. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, BIOS 3 data was nearly lost, saved only by a junior technician who smuggled files out in his coat lining during the 90s chaos. Today, those yellowed notebooks are gold for Mars planners, realizing that stockpiling freeze-dried meals won't cut it for multi-year missions. Debris cleanup faced similar neglect. In 1983, NASA engineer Jerome Pearson sketched the first space broom, a kilometer-long electrodynamic tether that could sweep orbits clean by slowing debris until it burned up. His calculations showed it could remove thousands of fragments per year for pennies per pound. The Pentagon funded a prototype, then shelved it when the Cold War ended. Now, with Starlink constellations dodging junk daily, startups are racing to build Pearson's exact design, unaware he'd debugged it decades ago. What unites these forgotten green pioneers isn't just bad timing, it's a mismatch between their long-term thinking and short-term politics. Vernikos's algae required years to perfect. BIOS 3 needed sustained funding. Pearson's tether demanded upfront investment for benefits decades away. In an era obsessed with quarterly results and election cycles, sustainability lost to expediency. The bitter lesson: space ecology isn't a technical challenge. It's a test of whether we can plan beyond our own lifespans. Now, as lunar bases and Mars missions force these issues back onto the table, there's poetic justice in watching modern engineers discover solutions from the 70s. When SpaceX studies algae for Mars habitats, they're walking Vernikos's path. When ESA tests tethers for debris removal, they're proving Pearson right. The future of orbital sustainability isn't just about new technology, it's about finally listening to the voices we ignored when they mattered most. Their ideas never went obsolete. We just left them waiting in the archives until reality caught up. Buried in a declassified 1964 Pentagon memo lies a sketch that could have rewritten orbital history: a crescent-shaped station bristling with missile pods, labeled Manned Orbiting Weapon System. This wasn't sci-fi fantasy. It was the brainchild of General Electric engineer Ralph Clark, who spent 2 years perfecting designs for a battle station capable of striking targets anywhere on Earth within 90 minutes. His team's blueprints, recently unearthed through FOIA requests, revealed chilling details: gyroscopic gun platforms, nuclear-tipped interceptors, even a proposed space-to-ground kinetic rod system that inspired Reagan's later rods from God concept. Yet what makes Clarke's story gripping isn't the hardware, it's the moral tightrope he walked. Private journals from his estate show a man torn between patriotic duty and sleepless nights, once scribbling, "Do we really want to turn the heavens into a shooting gallery?" The ethical fractures ran deeper than any individual. At Douglas Aircraft in 1967, propulsion specialist Linda Chen led development of the space-based laser cluster, a defensive system designed to blind Soviet satellites. Her breakthrough using hexagonal mirror arrays to focus beams was a masterpiece of optical engineering. But when superiors hinted the tech could also disable civilian spacecraft, Chen deliberately slowed progress, inserting flawed alignment tolerances into the specs. Her sabotage went undetected for months, buying time for diplomatic arms talks to advance. Decades later, declassified emails reveal her superiors' fury at the unexplained delays, never suspecting their star engineer had quietly neutered the project. These shadow stations faced technical hurdles as daunting as their moral quandaries. The Mall-manned orbiting laboratory, though publicly framed as a research platform, hid reconnaissance gear so advanced it overheated constantly. Engineers at Lockheed's Skunk Works resorted to coating optics with crushed diamond, dust the only material that could dissipate heat without warping. One test pilot's after-action report described the cabin as a sauna full of ticking time bombs, with coolant lines bursting under pressure and backup systems failing in cascades. Yet the teams pressed on, driven by Cold War urgency and the grim knowledge that if they didn't solve these problems, less scrupulous contractors would. The legacy of these covert programs lingers in today's orbital landscape. Modern satellite defense systems trace their lineage to Clarke's abandoned targeting algorithms, while Chen's mirror arrays evolved into the laser comms now linking constellations like Starlink. Even the MOL's diamond-coated optics found civilian use in deep space telescopes, but the starkest lesson lies in the memos and marginalia of those who built these systems, the underlined warnings about escalation risks, the sketches of repurposed components crossed out with peacefile use only. These engineers understood what their superiors often ignored. Once you weaponize orbit, there's no going back. Their quiet resistance, whether through slowdowns, redesigns, or leaked concerns, may have spared us a far darker cosmic reality. Chesley Bonestell's paintings of wheel-shaped space stations weren't just magazine cover fodder. They were blueprints smuggled into engineering meetings. When the famed sci-fi illustrator sketched his iconic rotating habitats in the 1950s, with their sweeping views of Earth through curved windows, physicists dismissed them as fantasy. But tucked away in NASA Langley Research Center, a group of young draftsmen names like Harold, Bud Evans, and Sylvia Johnson were quietly tracing Bonestell's curves onto vellum, translating his artistry into load-bearing calculations. Their breakthrough wasn't the spinning wheel itself, but the realization that its centrifugal force could be harnessed with segmented modules linked by flexible corridors, a concept that later birthed Skylab's experimental gravity sections. These anonymous adapters straddled two worlds, one foot in the slide-rule reality of aerospace contracts, the other in the neon-lit dreams of pulp magazines. The crossover went deeper than aesthetics when Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey debuted in 1968. Its rotating station set a new visual standard, but it was Boeing's forgotten concept artist, Robert McCall, who reverse-engineered Kubrick's vision for practical use. McCall's storyboards for NASA, a proposed space operations center, borrowed the film's slow-spinning elegance while solving real-world problems. His radial arms housed actual solar collectors, not Hollywood lighting rigs, and his docking ports aligned with Gemini-era spacecraft specs. This symbiosis between fiction and function reached its peak with Silent Running's greenhouse domes, which inspired a generation of engineers to fight for onboard botany labs. The film's art director, John Jefferies, later consulted on Biosphere 2, proving sci-fi's power to seed real research agendas. Yet the most profound influence came from sources few remember. Before Star Trek popularized sleek touchscreens, an unheralded industrial designer named Mark Benton drafted interactive control panels for Douglas Aircraft's orbital workshops in 1965. His team's light touch activation system, buttons that illuminated when approached, became the prototype for modern cockpit interfaces. Similarly, the Soviet Cosmos 1999 TV series featured modular stations with interchangeable pods, a concept that Ukrainian engineer Lydia Tarnopolsky adapted for Mir's expansion ports. These weren't coincidences, they were proof that pop culture didn't just predict the future, it funded it. Studios paid artists to dream big, while aerospace budgets only covered incremental steps. The visionaries who mattered most were the ones who could navigate both. The irony, many of these hybrid minds never got credit. Bonestell's name still graces art books, but Evans' stress analysis reports for rotating habitats were stamped confidential until 2010. McCall's Boeing storyboards were auctioned off as movie memorabilia, their engineering significance overlooked. Even Tarnopolsky's modular designs were attributed to Soviet engineering collectives in official records. Their legacy lives on every time a station window frames Earth like a Bonestell painting, or when astronauts glide through corridors that feel plucked from 2001. The future we got wasn't invented by scientists or artists alone. It was forged in the quiet spaces between imagination and graph paper, by people who knew that even the wildest dreams need welds and wiring diagrams. Look closely at the International Space Station's solar arrays, and you'll see the ghost of Sergei Korolov's unbuilt designs from 1962, those same zigzag hinges that let panels track the sun without motors. Or examine SpaceX's Dragon docking adapter, and you'll find Caldwell Johnson's minimalist latch system reborn in carbon fiber, 50 years after NASA shelved his prototypes for being too simple. The truth is, every modern spacecraft carries DNA from ideas that were once dismissed as impractical, too expensive, or just ahead of their time. Take the ISS's modular structure, seemingly a product of 90s international cooperation, but its roots stretch back to Georgy Grechko's Soviet blueprints from 1968. His original sketches of interlocking compartments, ridiculed for resembling a child's building blocks, now define orbital architecture. Even the station's much-praised plug-and-play experiment racks owe their existence to an obscure NASA intern's 1974 thesis on standardized lab interfaces, a concept her professors called unworkably rigid. Today, that rigidity is the backbone of microgravity research, allowing astronauts to swap experiments like server blades in a data center. Private companies are just as guilty of creative archaeology. When Bigelow Aerospace unveiled their inflatable habitat modules, they touted them as revolutionary, never mentioning how closely they mirrored NASA's TransHab project from 1997, which itself borrowed from Soviet elastic hull concepts of the 70s. Even the vaunted Starship's stainless steel skin traces back to Maxime Fagot's discarded heat shield proposals from the Gemini era, back when steel was too heavy for orbital construction. Now, with advanced alloys and reusable rockets, Fagot's outdated idea suddenly makes economic sense. The most poignant homages aren't just technical, they're human. When Axiom Space designed their commercial ISS modules, They included Galina Balashova's signature curved interior walls, a nod to the Soviet architect who proved beauty matters in zero-G. Blue Origin's orbital reef station plans feature Hans Moritz's spinning gravity rings, finally giving the German engineers' 1965 sketches their moment. These aren't coincidences, they're corrections, a quiet reckoning with the fact that brilliance isn't always recognized in its time, but orbit has a way of circling back to the truth. Perhaps the ultimate testament lies in the blueprints gathering dust today. The lunar depot concepts, the algae-based life support, the self-healing hull materials, all waiting for some future engineer to dig them up and say, "Why didn't we do this sooner?" The cycle continues because space exploration has always been less about inventing the future than rediscovering it, one forgotten genius at a time. As we stand on the brink of a new space age, the forgotten architects of orbital infrastructure whisper a crucial truth. Progress isn't just about the rockets that roar into the sky, it's about the quiet scribbles on napkins, the all-nighters in dimly lit labs, the ideas that were too bold for their time. These unsung pioneers didn't just design hardware, they designed futures, often knowing they'd never live to see them realized. Take Georgy Grechko's modular blueprints, dismissed as impractical until they became the backbone of the ISS. Or Harold Finger's lithium hydroxide scrubber, a humble canister that kept astronauts breathing while others took the credit. Their stories aren't just footnotes, they're masterclasses in perseverance, proving that innovation doesn't always wear a hero's cape. What makes their legacy so urgent today isn't just nostalgia, it's a roadmap. As private companies rush to build the next generation of space stations, they're facing the same problems these engineers solved decades ago. The difference: today's tools are better, but the wisdom is older. Hans Moritz's spinning gravity rings, once deemed too expensive, are now feasible with lightweight composites. Galina Balashova's ergonomic interiors, once labeled decorative, are now scientifically proven to reduce astronaut stress. The past isn't just prologue, it's a toolbox we've left gathering dust. Yet the greatest lesson isn't technical, it's philosophical. These visionaries worked without guarantees, often without recognition, driven by something deeper than fame or fortune. Margaret Hack calculated orbital trajectories knowing her name would be erased from the reports. Robert Swanson debugged life support code in his kitchen, understanding that success meant no one would notice his work. Their reward wasn't headlines, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd nudged humanity forward. In an era obsessed with viral moments and instant gratification, their patience is a radical reminder. Real progress is a relay race, not a sprint. So as we marvel at tomorrow's orbital hotels and Mars colonies, let's ask, who's missing from the picture? Whose breakthroughs are we unknowingly recycling? The next time you see a sleek new space station module, look closer. You might spot Konrad Dannenberg's modular seams or Linda Chen's sabotaged laser optics repurposed for peace. History has a way of circling back to the truth, but only if we're willing to dig. Now it's your turn. Which unsung hero story resonated with you? The cosmonaut who saved Saliot 7 with a wrench and sheer grit? The mathematician who plotted safe orbits on graph paper? Drop their name in the comments, because the best way to honor these forgotten architects isn't just to remember them, but to say their names out loud. And if you're hungry for more hidden histories that shape our future, hit subscribe. The cosmos is full of untold stories, and we're just getting